The OKC Thunder have basically spent the entire year growing into the NBA's preeminent villain, and yet if you would ask most NBA teams, they would probably tell you that an OKC Thunder championship is still what they would have wanted to see this season. Because a winning OKC team is gonna be patient. Had they won back-to-back titles, the Thunder would have most certainly brought back the bulk of their entire roster, minus some cuts to duck the second apron, and they would have just basically built on continuity on the way to winning a three-peat. Well, sure, injuries were such a huge part of OKC's loss in the Western Conference Finals, but then there's also no guarantee that the team will be healthier next season, while the San Antonio Spurs should also only get better from here on. So with that in mind, is it possible that the Thunder might have unlocked a more aggressive mindset this offseason, particularly in terms of trying to engineer a trade to acquire Giannis Antetokounmpo? Well, multiple reports have already surfaced about how OKC is unlikely to trade for Giannis. I myself don't believe that a Giannis trade to OKC makes a lot of sense either, and we'll talk about my reasons later. But still, this is the NBA and unlikely things happen all the time. So for this video, let's assume that Thunder would really want to create a dream scenario for Milwaukee and try to trade for Giannis. Now the questions are, how complicated would a cap situation get for OKC? Also, what would a trade package for Giannis actually look like? And at the end of it all, should OKC really want to do this trade? First off, for the Thunder, the main issue in terms of trying to acquire Giannis is the money. Giannis is set to make $58.5 million next season, and to match his salary, OKC would definitely have to aggregate multiple contracts in a trade. But then the thing is, teams are only allowed to aggregate contracts in a trade if their payroll is below the second apron. And given the situation, if you take into account OKC's 2 first-round picks in this year's draft, they are projected to be $39 million above the second apron threshold as of now. Therefore, between the trade itself and other moves they will have to make, OKC would need to send out almost $98 million worth of salary just to legally acquire Giannis in a deal this offseason. And that is actually a lot of money to shed for the Thunder, nearly all of which is attached to good players because OKC simply doesn't have bad contracts in their books. But for sure, if the Thunder really wanted to make this work, they can use relatively straightforward ways to get under the second apron to make way for a Giannis trade. Lu Dort has an $18.2 million team option for next season, and OKC can either decline that or pick it up for them to be able to trade Dort. Meanwhile, Aaron Wiggins and Ajay will make more than $20 million combined next season, and both players already have ready-made replacements in the Thunder's roster, so those two could easily be traded as well. So all in all, letting go of Dort, Joe, and Wiggins' salary should already put the Thunder technically slightly below the second apron threshold. But before we consider whether or not the Thunder should actually trade for Giannis, let's actually try to construct hypothetical trade packages here. And when doing that, we have to keep in mind the two components that need to be considered for any trade to actually become realistic, and those are the components of value and salary. In terms of value, the Thunder definitely have that down, as OKC could trade as much as 8 first-round picks if they really want to, which could include both the number 12 and the number 17 picks in this year's draft. And it's just hard to imagine any team outbidding an OKC Thunder offer based on draft picks, but even if anyone else does, those teams are probably not capable of throwing young talent in like Cason Wallace or Ajay Mitchell in a trade package. So basically, the Thunder have the capacity to win almost any bidding war for Giannis just because of the stockpile of draft picks as well as the young talent they have. But then second, there's also the salary component to be considered in a trade. And what we have to remember here is that the second apron threshold is projected to be around less than $222 million next season. And again, the Thunder have to be under that amount to make a legal trade for Giannis. But then looking at it, the 4 of Giannis, Shai, Jdub, and Chet will already be making a combined $181.7 million next season alone, which means keeping all 4 of them together would give OKC only $40 million left to allocate to 10 remaining roster spots, assuming they would only roster 14 players to save money. So given the situation, the question is, can OKC still keep both Jdub and Chet after trading for Giannis? Well, I think maybe in theory they can, just because the Thunder have so many cheap players, they could technically just build a trade package centered around draft picks together with some of their bigger contracts, which the Bucks could also probably flip for more draft picks. So ideally, in a draft pick-centric package for Giannis, I think you would have to include iHeart with his $28.5 million team option. Then you would most likely also have to include Caruso and his $19.5 million salary for next season, and you would most likely have to include one of Aaron Wiggins or Isaiah Joe to match salaries. And that's in addition to maybe at least 5 first-round picks you have to send Milwaukee, which would also most likely include both of OKC's first-rounders in this year's draft. Well, in this scenario, Lou Dort and who's ever not included in the trade package between Joe and Wiggins would also have to be traded to another team to clear salary for the Thunder. Plus, Kenrich Williams would most likely also be traded or have his team option declined, assuming the Thunder would prioritize to surround their new core four with younger, cheaper players. But then again, as we talked about earlier, having Giannis, Shai, Jdub, and Chet would leave OKC with only $40 million left to allocate to maybe 10 remaining roster spots. So who would they be able to keep with that amount? Well, technically, they'd be able to keep Cason Wallace, who makes $7.4 million next season, Jared McCain, who makes $4.4 million, as well as Ajay Mitchell, who's gonna make $2.9 million. All three of those players fit wonderfully next to OKC stars, and all three for now are all underpaid. But still, keeping that trio still leaves OKC with just $25 million to spend with 7 roster spots left to fill. Well, given the scenario, OKC could still mostly keep 3 of their cheaper players. There's Jay Will, who's a reliable backup stretch big, so keeping him makes sense. Nikola Topic as a developmental ball handler and shot creator could also be an important piece off the bench. And same goes with Thomas Sorber, who's a potential long-term frontcourt piece for the Thunder. But then now, when you keep those 3 players, the Thunder will only be left with $7.1 million with 4 roster spots still left to be filled. And the problem is, what that amount could basically afford are just 2 veteran minimum contracts as well as 2 minimum rookie contracts. So basically, the problem here is that even in the best case scenario in which the Thunder managed to keep all their best young cheap talent out of a trade for Giannis, roster building could still be very difficult. Plus, another thing is, if the Bucks demand at least 1 or 2 of Cason Wallace, Ajay Mitchell, or Jared McCain to be included in the deal, then the entire concept falls apart for the Thunder. Even without including those players in a trade, a move like this would be so out of character for OKC. This team is always given a premium on depth as much as any team in the NBA. They just don't usually play their stars big minutes, and they basically utilize everyone on their roster. That's part of how they've managed to win 132 games over the past 2 regular seasons despite having injuries. And of course, we have to consider the long-term salary implications as well. SGA's Supermax contract kicks in next offseason, and so does the potential rookie extension for Cason Wallace. Ajay Mitchell is also 2 years away from being an unrestricted free agent, and of course, we shouldn't forget that Giannis will most likely demand a Supermax extension as well, either in the 2027 offseason or the next, as he still has a $62.8 million player option to decide on for the 2027 to 2028 season. Basically, a Thunder roster with Giannis would just be the most expensive team in NBA history by a wide margin, especially in the years to come, which doesn't exactly make the roster sustainable. But then, instead of building a trade package centered on draft picks, if the Thunder put one of Chet or Jdub on the table as the centerpiece of a Giannis deal, then that changes the entire equation. But then again, the question here for the Thunder is, how do they juggle their salary? And most importantly, which one of Jdub or Chet would the Thunder rather trade if they would have to choose? Well, in the playoffs, OKC got a glimpse of life without Jdub, and it might be reasonable to assume that had Ajay Mitchell stayed healthy against the Spurs, the Thunder might have been back in the NBA Finals despite Jdub's injuries. While on the other hand, Chet still hasn't grown as an individual shot creator in the ways OKC likely hoped for. But ultimately, if I had to pick one, I'm guessing the Thunder would still lean towards keeping Chet. Even if he's still not the shooter his reputation suggests, teams that feature Giannis always needed a center option who can at least somewhat space the floor. Chet spaces the floor better than 90% of all bigs in the NBA, and his elite rim protection would be a necessity for the Thunder as Giannis' interior defense has actually slipped in recent years. Sure, on the other hand, Jdub is the only elite wing-size defender on the Thunder roster, but Alex Caruso still defends bigger players as well as anyone in the league. Basically, at this point of his career, I think Giannis hypothetically would go further replacing Jdub as a ball handler than he would replacing Chet as a defender, and I just think Chet would be a somewhat cleaner fit next to Giannis, that is, assuming Chet starts to take more three-pointers. But either way, Giannis would still make around $17.2 million more than either Jdub or Chet next season. And again, considering the $39 million above the second apron the Thunder are currently at, they're still gonna have to shed around $56 million in a Giannis deal on top of what they're sending out between either Jdub or Chet to duck the second apron. So again, same as the previous scenario, Dort, Wiggins, and Joe would most likely have to be traded, as letting go of those three would allow OKC to shed almost $39 million, leaving them with just $17 million needed to be shed for them to get under the second apron. And technically, the Thunder could shed that money by letting go of Kenrich Williams, Topic, and Thomas Sorber, who'll make a combined $17.5 million next season. Well sure, all three players would provide cheap depth for the Thunder, but you have to let go of them if you are to keep both I Hart and Alex Caruso, because I'm thinking if OKC is gonna prioritize going all in after trading for Giannis and after letting go of one of Chet or Jdub, I imagine they would want to keep both Caruso and Ihart. Caruso is one of the best role players in the entire NBA, and while Ihart's fit with Giannis is questionable given both of them don't shoot three-pointers, Ihart's signature push shot will still force defenders to guard him at least out to the mid-range, and on defense, it functioned much as Brook Lopez once did for Giannis, by hanging near the rim and taking on the more physically exhausting frontcourt matchups. Ihart's also one of the league's very best screeners who would excel at clearing space for Giannis and Shai when they drive. But in addition, the Thunder could still potentially close the gap in terms of their payroll by maybe sending out their 2 first-round picks this year to Milwaukee as well, which could save OKC another $10 million. But I suspect that if they would have to send out some more picks in a deal, they would rather trade some of those in the future, and that's because if the Thunder pursue Giannis, the championship window for OKC closes in to maybe the next 4 to 5 years at most, and given that, they'd probably want to keep their 2 first-round picks this year and use them to draft meaningful contributors who could grow in a few years' time once Giannis declines. So all in all, I think in a trade for Giannis wherein you have one of Chet or Jdub as the centerpiece, the Thunder would still likely have to include one of Joe or Wiggins and probably a cheaper player in Nikola Topic to make salaries work, in addition to probably 2 or 3 future first-round picks at most. But of course, even if the Thunder pull off a trade like this, they would also have to worry about other things, such as having to re-sign Ihart to a long-term extension this offseason, as well as also likely having to convince Giannis to take a slightly lesser amount in a potential max extension that OKC would offer next offseason. And while it's unlikely that Giannis takes a pay cut, considering how much better his odds at winning a second ring in Oklahoma City are, maybe Giannis might actually do so. Regardless, the Thunder will still have to carry a massive financial burden and most likely also gut their roster depth at the same time if they go after Giannis. So with that said, should the Thunder really trade for Giannis? Well, sure, it might be reasonable to think that Giannis could be a solution to the Victor Wembanyama problem. Looking at it, Giannis and Wemby have faced 4 times so far in the NBA, wherein the Bucks and the Spurs split those 4 games. Giannis averaged 31.3 points against Wembanyama's 22.3 points. But none of those games happened when both the Bucks and the Spurs had fully healthy rosters, so it's just hard to take the outcomes of those games seriously. But overall, Giannis is strong enough to pose real problems for the skinnier Wembanyama near the basket, and Giannis is also more than capable of guarding him on the perimeter while also being the single best bat in the NBA to get Wemby in foul trouble. Well, if you're in favor of the Thunder trading for Giannis, one argument you could make here is that OKC might not have the seemingly infinite runway that they appear to have in terms of winning. Shai turns 28 in a few weeks and is almost 6 years older than Wembanyama. And while Shai will still definitely be capable of leading a Thunder team in about 5 years' time, Wembanyama will still be improving, and same can be said about Dylan Harper and Stephon Castle, who both appear to have superstar ceilings as well. So maybe you could argue that it's reasonable for OKC to go for a Giannis trade now to hold the Spurs off before they even reach their peak form, while ultimately accepting that doing so would probably shorten the Thunder's championship window. But with that said, ultimately, I would still argue that the Thunder should still prioritize longevity over peak, and as tempting as a Giannis trade would be, I believe OKC would pass. Well, first off, looking at it, OKC did a better job against Wemby in the conference finals than the outcome suggests. Wemby got 23 total paint touches in Game 1 of the series when the Thunder played small, but then Wemby just totaled 35 paint touches in Games 2 to 7. Sure, Wembanyama will get stronger and get better at positioning himself around the basket, but OKC ultimately succeeded in minimizing Wemby's dominance near the rim. That meant forcing him to take jumpers, but it's just that Wembanyama made those jumpers he took. Well, perhaps Giannis could make Wembanyama's life even harder, but with someone as good as Wemby, there's only so much an individual defender can do. At the end of the day, the real problem for OKC in the conference finals was their offense. Wemby completely took away the rim and forced the Thunder to shoot three-pointers. And the fact is, in OKC's 3 wins, they shot 41.5% from deep, but in their 4 losses, they shot just 29.4% from the three-point line. That was a problem last year too, as OKC shot just 32% from the three-point line in their 7 postseason losses. Well, OKC has gotten by with overwhelming talent and defense, but they've never really been an elite three-point shooting team. Basically, without Jdub and Ajay Mitchell, it essentially boiled down to the role players outside shooting, and that is something they just couldn't sustain for the whole conference finals. The thing is, even if Jdub remained hurt, I think the version of Ajay Mitchell that OKC had against the Lakers would have been good enough to get the Thunder closer to beating San Antonio. In Game 2 alone, the Thunder scored 122 points with Jdub playing just 7 minutes, and it was ultimately losing Mitchell in Game 3 that was the tipping point for OKC. But then again, if the Thunder had both Jdub and Mitchell, then the offense would have just looked like a totally different animal. And if staying healthy is the problem, it's also hard to imagine Giannis being the solution moving forward, given all of the calf injuries he's dealt with the past 3 seasons. Sure, some would argue that Jdub should be traded for him because Jdub may be injury prone from here on, but even if that was the case, Jdub's still much younger and considerably less expensive than Giannis. Well, what about Chet? Sure, the fact that he failed to step up when the Thunder needed him the most was concerning, but whatever limited him in the conference finals was more than just a Victor Wembanyama problem. Bottom line is, without Jdub, without Ajay Mitchell, and with the worst version of Chet we've ever seen, the Thunder were trailing by just 3 points heading into the fourth quarter of Game 7. And the fact is, OKC got to a Game 7 despite Shai having a subpar shooting series. Well, at the end of the day, as a Thunder fan for a long time now, I've known for a fact that Sam Presti's roster building approach has always been about redundancy and depth. Basically, having a surplus of everything in terms of ball handling and defense, so if ever injuries chip away at one area, they're still going to be covered elsewhere. And this year, it's just that the multiple ball handling losses proved too significant to overcome for OKC. But either way, with or without Giannis, the Thunder should be back in the title hunt next season. Sure, Wembanyama's presence will challenge just about every preconceived notion in terms of roster building, and sure, Sam Presti's made some bold moves before, but is definitely not impulsive. I just don't think Presti's gonna destroy the homegrown roster he's built after showing just one crack, especially if bad injury luck is mostly to blame for their shortcomings this year. So ultimately, if the Milwaukee Bucks are hoping that OKC's loss will compel them to get into the mix for Giannis, I think Milwaukee's just gonna end up being disappointed. So, thank you guys if you've actually made it this far into the video, but do you actually expect Sam Presti to surprise us with a big trade this offseason? Feel free to drop your thoughts in the comment section below, and again, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing as well. Again, this has been Real Balls, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.